Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the world between the wars in our continuing study of the history of civilizations. The Bolshevik Revolution took place, the stage was set by World War I as the Russian casualties, both from warfare but also from starvation, numbered up in the area of 2 million. Farmers were out serving as soldiers, and so farms were just let to go, and the entire country was plunged into turmoil by a lack of food. Food was confiscated and it was being used to provide for the army. There was mass starvation. On top of this, Rasputin, a self-declared holy man, had ingratiated himself into the lives of the emperor and his family, and he was accused of all sorts of deeds. I don't know if even half of them are true, but he had become the most unpopular person in Russia, and as he was murdered right at the end of 1916, it would not be long before the Tsar also would take a fall. Sure enough, on March 14th, 1917, Tsar Nicholas abdicated, and as he abdicates, a provisional government is set up in Russia with the intent of having a more democratic, more westernized sort of outlook. Now, that's not going to last even throughout that year. Instead, we'll have two groups, the Mensheviks, and remember the Menshevik means the minority, and then the Bolshevik means the majority. However, the Bolsheviks, they were, even though they weren't the majority, they called themselves that, and you're going to have the Bolshevik Revolution now. The November 1917 revolution is led by Lenin. He's actually going to be one of three. You have Lenin himself pictured in the middle, Leon Trotsky, who was the military mind, he's over on the right, and then Joseph Stalin, who would eventually replace Lenin a good almost not quite 10 years later. The first thing the Bolsheviks do as they have come to power is they make a peace treaty, or at least a ceasefire with Germany. And so the Eastern Front comes to a close. World War II is continuing, or sorry, World War I is continuing. But in the meantime, you have a civil war that breaks out. The Bolshevik Revolution doesn't take place, and everybody agrees now. Instead, you have, and they're given these terms by the armband that they would take up, because they don't necessarily have two different sets of uniforms. You have the White Russians; these are the former generals of the Tsar, and you have the Red Army headed by Trotsky. As I said, he's the military mind, whereas Lenin will be the politics, and then Stalin will eventually be his replacement. They form now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now, just because you're using the word republics doesn't mean that it actually is one. Remember, a republic is a form of government where you vote for your leaders, and then they rule. And of course, there's not too much voting, not too much in the way of political parties. It's turned quickly into more of a dictatorship, and we're going to call it, because that's a mouthful to say, the USSR for short. Their stance is going to be communistic, and by communism I mean that there will no longer be private ownership. Everything is owned now by the government, and the government is the one responsible for giving to all of the people. And the idea is that everything will now be free and equal. So there's no more private property. Industry will no longer be owned by corporations or by people. They are now all state-run and state-owned. Banks are owned by the state. There's no more private banking. And the news organizations are also owned and operated by the state, which means there's no freedom of the press. The press will say whatever the government tells them to say. The church is going to come under heavy persecution. The church in Russia was, for the most part, the Russian Orthodox Church. And their property will quickly be confiscated. All church properties are going to be confiscated. Church officers are executed. There's going to be a flood of anti-religious literature because the official stance of the Communist Party is that of atheism, that there is no God. Religious education is outlawed. Lenin, however, has a stroke in 1922, and that's going to leave, remember, Trotsky and Stalin. Stalin will now take over as dictator, and Trotsky will go into exile. He'll actually travel to the Western Hemisphere. Stalin now institutes a policy of forced collectivization. A lot of people had been reluctant to give up their possessions, and so he goes in there and takes it from them. And this results in famine. After all, if somebody's going to be farming and yet they don't keep any of the crops, and they say, well, why should I farm if the government's going to take everything that I own? I might just as well let my farm, go to pieces. And there are people that destroy their crops because rather than hand them over to the government, and that means that lots and lots of people are starving. There are purges both for politics. In fact, Stalin. Now it's interesting. We look at Stalin and we say, he was paranoid, he was crazy, he was ruthless, he was evil, he was cruel. Russians oftentimes look at Stalin and say, yes, he was all those things, but that's what we needed to bring us through this dark period. So the purges were both political, purges in the military. The military is going to go through a huge upheaval where all officers, just about, are going to be put to death because they were authority figures, and Stalin doesn't want any authority figures beside himself. And he's going to throw his country into it's going to become an industrial country. Industrial production will be their big emphasis. There will be new factories built, and he does succeed in a number of these things. There will be heavy industry. At that time, you go through Russia, and even today, the last we've been in former communist countries before, but it was especially striking when we were in Russia, part of the former USSR. And our guides would talk about the great factories, and this was the most beautiful palace, and this was the most beautiful this or that. Everything was lots of superlatives because they're used to doing that, because that's what the government told them to say. Now, the entire world in the 1930s is starting in the late 20s and going into the 1930s is going to be plunged into what we call the Great Depression. A economic upheaval that will lay off millions from their jobs, from their work. Stock markets crash. Investors either lose their money or take it and hoard it. And it's going to be a very dark period, not just in Russia, in the USSR, but all throughout the world. Now, prior to that, leading up to that, you'd had what, in fact, it gets the term, the Roaring Twenties, because there had been a period of great economic. The stock market had been a sort of a new idea where you could take your money and invest it, and just in a matter of a couple of years, it would double. And so, if you knew that was going to happen, and it was happening. People were just taking their money, putting it in the stock market and seeing it double. They were actually borrowing money to put more money in the stock market so that could double as well. And it was a booming economy, and people thought, well, that will just continue and continue, and it did for a time. People became wealthier and wealthier, but when it came crashing down, they would lose everything. This was the time of modernity. For example, they were looking at automobiles. Henry Ford had his automobile, and he is mass producing it. and he is making it cheap enough where his workers can afford to buy one. And of course, that means he's also paying his workers a bit more. The one condition is that they could not unionize. But why would they want to unionize if they're already making more than what non-union people are already making? It was a great impetus. And somebody asked him, "Well, your Model T, can you make it in any other colors?" And he rather jokingly replied, "Sure, it can be any color you want as long as it's black." This is also the time of the radio, where you have this mass communication, not just for military purposes, like we talked about during World War I, but now where people can own a radio and they can hear this voice being transmitted. For example, they're going to be able to hear, later on we'll talk about the fireside chats of the President of the United States. Movies are a new phenomena, where now initially they're just picture images, moving images on a screen, and later on, here in the 1920s, we're going to add a new idea. We're going to have what they call talkies, movies that actually have sound with them. And so you have Al Jolson, the jazz singer. That's actually one of the very first talking, and in this case, singing movies. And it was a brand new, absolutely wonderful phenomenon. Aviation was continuing to see progress. Remember we had the biplanes of World War I, which could fly a limited distance. Charles Lindbergh made history with his Spirit of St. Louis, in which he flew over the Atlantic Ocean, flying all the way to Paris and landing, or it was France, I don't know if it was close to Paris, and landing in France. Penicillin, a new medicine that was developed and would combat so many different infections. And it looked like disease now was beginning to be conquered as well. Women's styles underwent a radical transformation. And what we're looking at here was considered quite risque. And yet these different fashions begin to catch on. Women's suffrage, where women now were going to get the right to vote. That had never been done before. That was another brand new phenomena. Music underwent a variety of extremes. You have things like jazz, which are brought about using some of the African beat and off tempos from those who had back in the previous century both been brought into this country and then had been freed from their slavery and now have developed their own culture, blending some of the rhythms and ideas of music from previous times, bringing those into the modern time of the 1920s. Dance clubs began to be the rage. You also have America engaging in a period of anti-immigration. It had gone through different phases of this before, but remember the United States, I want to say America, as I'm talking about the United States of America, where anti-immigration laws were written up, and immigration was very fiercely regulated. The American Indians hadn't had any laws like that, and I've often kidded that if they'd had stricter immigration laws, a lot of us wouldn't be here today. But the United States is going to take a very hands-off and standoff stance from people coming in, and also from involvement in Europe. After all, that had gotten them into a war in previous times. This is also the era of prohibition, in which one of the amendments to the Constitution actually outlaws the buying and selling of alcohol for consumption purposes. That's going to last through the 20s, and then another amendment will come along, and prohibition will be repealed. This is also the age of the Scopes trial. Gives us a picture of philosophy and thinking and Christianity. Scopes had been a high school phys ed teacher, and he had been called upon. He'd actually known what he was doing. In the state of Tennessee, it was considered illegal to teach the theory of evolution. And so he had agreed to be sort of a test case. And he was, like I said, a substitute teacher, and he went in and taught a biology class, and he taught the theory of evolution. And so, sure enough, he was, the state took action against him, and the case went to trial. And representing Scopes was Clarence Darrow, seated over here on the left, William Jennings Bryan, who had already served as the Vice President of the United States, so he was very, very popular, well-known figure. He served as the prosecution, and it went to trial. At the end of the trial, Scopes was found guilty because, after all, he had taught evolution, and it was against the law in Tennessee. He was fined something like $5, which was quite a bit more money back then. And Bryan actually paid his fine. So even though they were on different sides of the case, they were not like hateful or anything like that. Um, they were arguing the case, and yet these were two consummate professionals doing that. But even though Scopes had lost the case for evolution had won in the court of popular opinion, and creationists were made to not look all that smart when it came to these issues. It was really a defeat, I think, for Christianity. Now, we've already talked about the Great Depression, how it would come. The stock market crashed in October 1929, so suddenly people who had vested their life savings because they had been making money so very quickly, suddenly they lost it all. And there were runs on the banks, both in the United States and in Europe, and eventually this would run all over the world where banks were failing. There were breadlines and people losing their homes, their jobs, their ways of supplying. Most people don't have a lot of money set aside where if they're not working, they can continue to pay their bills for weeks and months on end. And so people were facing starvation and the loss of homes. And in many cases, people men who were ashamed would just walk away from their families. They could not support them. And this became a tragic and very difficult time. Added to this, in the 1930s, 1935, there was a huge dust storm that came across the Middle Americas and added its issues to agriculture. As a result, we can see a great deal of Middle America where farms lost their crops. Food was difficult to come by. It was a very, very difficult time, and the country was still in the midst of this Great Depression. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected in 1932. He's going to be the only American president who serves or is elected at least, to 4 different terms of office. He'll die at the beginning of his 4th term, so he won't be able to serve that completely. He is the nephew, if I remember correctly, of Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president previous to him. And then, while still a young man, he had undergone polio, contracted polio, and had suffered paralysis from the waist down, so that he was confined to a wheelchair. He becomes president after Herbert Hoover, who had been the president at the time the Great Depression hit. Now, Hoover just had the bad fortune. He had been Hoover had been a very wealthy businessman who had become president and had the idea that the business of America is business. And so Roosevelt becomes president in the midst of the Great Depression. He comes out in his first 100 days with what he called the New Deal. It was a jobs program intending to seek to put people back to work. They would create jobs and get people to work, and of course, remember, to put people back to work, the government's going to be paying their salary. But it began to both do that and to influence other forms of jobs that would eventually put people back on a working platform. He is quoted at one point. He says, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." Well, I'm not sure how true that is, but it revolutionized and it encouraged the country at a time when the country needed hope. Uh, Roosevelt made great use of the radio. He would have at different times, not on a regular basis, but fairly regular, what he called his fireside chats, where he would go on the radio, and you got the idea that here he is. By the way, he titled it "Sitting by the Fireplace." He's invited you into his home, and he gets to talk to you as if you were visiting his home via the radio. And people very oftentimes now had a radio in their homes where they could listen now to these chats. He also passes a bill for what's going to be called Social Security. That's something that we still have today, which is going to be sort of a help to prevent people from starving to death if they are old and can't work, or if they're infirmed and can't work. It's not necessarily meant to as a replacement for your own personal retirement, but it provides something of a safety net. Um, and most people today think, that was a good idea. Although at the time it was very unpopular, there were those that were saying he's trying to turn us into a communist country. He wasn't, and this didn't become one. It didn't do away with private property, but it was a social program that was and continues to be quite effective. Now, meanwhile, in Europe had gone through the same depression, and yet the reaction there had been very different, especially in Germany, where a new chancellor had risen to power and would change everything, and his name was Adolf Hitler, and we'll see him next time.